Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm Paul Gangsey, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Executive Director of Brooklyn Law School's Center for Urban Business Entrepreneurship, a new venture that was started just about a year ago and has really taken off. The program today features one of the important missions of CUBE, which is to train our law students to work in the commercial, the not-for-profit, and the public sectors with new ventures, and in particular to understand how those sectors can work together to really empower the entrepreneurial world. To get us started today, I'd like to invite Dean Nick Allard, Dean, President, Professor of Law, and my favorite supporter of CUBE, to give us some welcoming remarks.
Thank you. Did he say mean remarks? Mean? Mean. Brief? Oh, okay. Somebody asked me to be brief and funny last night, and I told them they had to choose. I won't tell you which choice they made. It was a long night. So I had this feeling yesterday too, but standing here in the cathedral of traditional legal education, the moot courtroom, and staring up at these iconic Eastern District judges, Corman, Glasser, and the others, seeing Judge Stong in the back, I have this little devil on my shoulder making me feel like this is kind of as much naughty fun as stealing a kiss in church here. You know, we're talking about one of the hippest aspects, new aspects of legal education, and that's figuring out how to be lawyers for entrepreneurs. So it's kind of juxtaposition of the setting and what we're all about here today. I think that's marvelous. My wife says that my autobiography will be, the title should be I Digress. So I'm going to begin in a way that I think is apt and not off-center, but it might seem like it's a digression. This is Women's History Month, and I'd like to point out that even in our first decade here, Brooklyn Law School welcomed women to legal education, and they were outstanding right from the start. And there were many, many women, but notable, for example, was Edith Adelaide Miller, who was a student in the 6-month real estate course during the law school's very first year. The class of 1906 included feminist pioneer Rosalie Gardner Jones, a well-known leader in the women's right to vote movement. Jeanette Brill, the class of 08, that's 1908, would go on to be a founder of the Brooklyn Women's Bar Association and a judge of the Magistrates and Domestic Relations Court. The class of 1910 included Ida Podolewski, known as Miss I, who, according to the class book, you can look it up, the Comet, she was, quote, the brightest student and vice president of the class. And the list goes on and on. So I mention that not only because it's Women's History Month, but because it demonstrates that Brooklyn Law School has, from its very beginning, been a pioneer. It has it in its DNA, or given this group, and looking at Professor Askin, in its software. And so, you know, it sounds like Yogi Berra might have said this, but at Brooklyn Law School, change is nothing new. That's what we're all about. So he should have said it if he didn't say it, right? So when it's almost a cliche now at law schools to say, we want to have an entrepreneurship program. We want to teach entrepreneurship. We want to study entrepreneurship. And really, one of the reasons why there's so many things where we can truly be proud about being the best, is with CUBE. It really is the best. There's nothing like it across the country. It's comprehensive. It's top to bottom. It's scholarly work. It's programs and conferences. It's hands-on education. It's a Shark Tank competition. It's fellowships. It's a certificate for students to help them find work. And it's embedding people with real people who are trying to start new businesses and teaching them how to become lawyers for startups and new businesses. But it's also not one-dimensional. It's, everybody knows this cube has 6 sides. Most people think of the sides of the cube that involve for-profit businesses and tech in particular, and that relates to, certainly we do that at CUBE, do it well. I understand there were 80 projects and 160 clients last year in that area, and so, in its very first year, we had high expectations, but CUBE was exceeding its expectations. But a very, very important and emerging area is the area of social enterprise work, and it's entrepreneurial work, among other things, in a social enterprise, not-for-profit, nonprofit setting. Now, this shouldn't be a surprise that we are very strong in that area for 2 reasons. One is we have an unbelievable faculty that work in that area, including Vice Dean Dana Brockman-Reeser and Stephen Dean, just in the forefront of this area, nationally and internationally. But also, when you think about it, CUBE fits that model. We're not for profit. CUBE is not for profit. And it's an enterprise that is run in an entrepreneurial fashion in a very non-traditional way within a not-for-profit setting. So in other words, rather just take the funding alone. CUBE went out and got some angel investors. Unlike most academics, I think I got a little bit in trouble when I said this approach to financing CUBE was for Paul and for me a multiple change of underwear experience, but we got 18 months of funding, and we had to prove ourselves, and the founders who, I think each of the founders probably had the capacity to endow CUBE in perpetuity in the traditional way, but they wanted us to be put to the mark of having to prove ourselves and also not commit funds for something on day one that seemed like it makes sense, but then make adjustments along the way. Now, not every member of the faculty and not every member of the public are completely comfortable when I say at CUBE, we're building the airplane while we're flying it. But you know what I'm talking about. I mean, we're kind of figuring out what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, what works, what needs to be strengthened. So this discussion today that you're all going to have, and the panel discussions, our keynote, Michael Schlein, and then the programs afterwards are very much going to be focused on this social enterprise side of our multidimensional CUBE program. And I wish I could spend time with you today. I can't. I'm going to go see I have a meeting with trying to seek some relief in what I believe is the problems and flaws of the bar exam, and I'm very committed to trying to improve the bar exam for our students and also get to the bottom of what happened. Brooklyn Law School did incredibly well as usual last year, but to me, I think that the system is very costly and does not protect the public, serve our students, and certainly doesn't serve the profession. So I think we can do a lot better. So I'm going to run off to take that, but I'll be very eager to hear about this program, and I hope you enjoyed as much as I know I would have if I had been able to stay here. Thank you very, very much.
Allard, and it's now my pleasure to introduce Michael Schlein, our keynote speaker for this morning. Michael is the president and CEO of Axion, which is a global nonprofit dedicated to building a financially inclusive world. Axion specializes in microfinance, as I'm sure many of you know, and has built 64 microfinance institutions in more than 32 countries around the world. They also provide seed capital to new companies that promote innovation in financial services. In his spare time, Michael serves at the request of our mayor as the chairman of New York City's Economic Development Corporation. So he embodies this blend of sectors that we're talking about this morning. Michael.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Paul, and thanks, Dean Allard, and thank all of you for joining today. And also I want to thank Professor John Askin for inviting me to speak. For some of his students are in the room, and many of you, for those of you who know him, you know he's smart and funny and witty. What you may not know is he's also one of the best poker players I've ever met. I also appreciate that I got to walk all of 5 minutes to be here, so I thank you for that. This is incredibly convenient. And I also, my other connection here is my wife is a BLS alum, and so literally this morning I was working out in the gym with my Brooklyn Law School t-shirt on. So I have many connections here, and it's a pleasure to be with you all today. I like the phrase, change is nothing new. I may have to use that. Innovation is shaping our world at a faster rate than any time in history. And there's a great deal of energy and excitement around trying to tackle some of the society's greatest challenges, like poverty, health, education, clean water, climate issues. New social enterprises are being created every day, and they're fueled by new funding mechanisms that make it all possible. I see that at Axion, I see that at the New York City Economic Development Corporations. It's inspiring. It's more than a trend. It's really a movement. Commercial, philanthropic, public resources are all combining to create a variety of new funding mechanisms, like impact investing and social impact bonds, and you'll hear more about them on the panel today. And the creativity that I see all the time is making and will make a profound difference in our lives and around the world. At Axion is a nonprofit, and our mission is to create a financially inclusive world. Let me describe a little bit. What does that mean? So for all of you, you have credit cards, you have ATMs on every corner, you can borrow money to buy a house, to finance an education, to build a business. Your life is easy. You can get insurance. Your life is easier. Well, even this one. Think about the basic match of your bills come due roughly every month, and your income comes in roughly every month. You take all that for granted, as you should. Now, switch to a typical, there are 2.5 billion people who live in poverty and lack access to financial services. A typical would be a woman living, a farmer living in the Philippines, for example. No ATMs, no credit cards. She lives in a completely cash world. She gets paid once a year at the time of the harvest and has to make that money work all year round. And yet she lacks what we can take for granted. She lacks a safe place to save her money. More likely than not, she's saving her money in cash or jewelry or livestock, and cash can get lost, jewelry can get stolen, and livestock can die. She lives in a world that could be subject to typhoons but could never get insurance. That huge mismatch between her income and her expenses is an enormous challenge. Living in a cash world, every payment is very, very expensive and difficult. She may send a relative to work in the United States or somewhere else, and that relative may spend $15 to send her $100. That's very, very expensive to remit money home. The point is, her life is harder, much harder, just because of where she was born. Just because she was born in a place that doesn't have the financial infrastructure that we all take for granted. As I said, 2.5 billion people today live in poverty and lack access to financial services. We can change that. We must change that. We can give people the financial tools they need to really improve their lives. If we can create a financially inclusive world, there's an enormous economic, social, and societal return. This is what Axion does. This is our mission. We've been around for over 50 years now, and the numbers have even changed. We've now helped to create 66 microfinance institutions in 34 countries. We keep growing. As Paul said, we're also doing venture capital investing in startups, all working on innovation in financial services for the poor. Philanthropy is very, very important and allows us to go places and try new things that we would never otherwise be able to do. But if your ambition is to reach 2.5 billion people, all the philanthropy in the world is insufficient to that task. You have to tap the capital markets. If you have a problem as enormous as poverty, you need a weapon. You need something as forceful as the capital markets. Literally, all the philanthropy in the world is not enough to make a difference in global poverty. Let me describe the evolution of Axion, because we're talking today about innovations in how we can finance social enterprise, and the history of financial inclusion, the history of Axion, is actually a history of innovations in financing social enterprise. You'll see what I mean. In 1961, Axion was created, actually in Venezuela, largely as a community development organization. Think of it as a private sector Peace Corps, which is quite extraordinary because in 1961, the Peace Corps did not exist. In fact, one of our founders went on to run the Peace Corps, actually in the Nixon administration, surprisingly. And for a dozen years, we worked in communities with people living in poverty. In the early 1970s, we realized our clients needed capital. And so think about this. In 1973, my predecessors began lending to people living in poverty. That was not out-of-the-box thinking. That was out-of-your-mind thinking. That was insane. And yet, it turned out that they could repay loans, small loans, 97% of the time, a statistic that has held up over decades. We were doing that in Latin America. Professor Muhammad Yunus was doing that in Bangladesh. Others were doing that in Southeast Asia, and modern microfinance had its roots in the early 70s. So in the 80s, Axion built a string of nonprofits in almost every Latin American country. And there, our source of funding, of course, was philanthropy. And they grew, but they quickly reached the CEOs were spending all their time fundraising. They quickly needed greater capital. And one innovation was we helped create one of the first guarantee funds for nonprofits, where Axion provided the guarantee that allowed these local nonprofits in Latin America to access bank funding, which allowed them to grow faster. In 1992, a very, very, very important event in this world, we helped create the first for-profit bank for the poor. We took a nonprofit and created it as a for-profit. It's called Banco Sol, and it exists today. It's one of the best microfinance institutions in the world. And what happened was, now it's easy to say this, but it was bold at the time, all of a sudden it could access the debt markets. All of a sudden it could access the equity markets. All of a sudden it was regulated a different way. It could attract talent in a different way. Later on it could take deposits. Banco Sol had been doing very well, but it took off. So we then went back to all those nonprofits that we had created and reconstituted them as for-profits, and so Axion became an early equity investor in what became, and we helped build, many of the great microfinance institutions all around the world. Now, when they are run well, and we like to think we run them well, they can not only have a huge social impact, but they can actually generate 20, 25, 30% return on equity. And we're a nonprofit, so anything that we earn from these enterprises goes back to our mission. So over time, we have expanded, and we're in a half dozen countries in Africa. We're in India, China, the Philippines, and most recently we entered Myanmar. Another social innovation along the way is we created one of the first microfinance investment funds. So we were working with our own donated capital and our own earnings. But what we did was we wanted to tap the capital markets and bring others into this field. And so we created a fund and brought in other investors. And over its 10-year life, the Axion Investment Fund helped build and helped expand great institutions in Bolivia, Peru, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Ecuador, but also Nigeria, Ghana, Cameroon, Tanzania. And at the end of 10 years, our investors realized a 15.6% annual rate of return over the decade, which is terrific, terrific. And so we demonstrated that you can have a big social impact and a great financial return. Now, over that same decade, we created the demonstration, but what we saw was fantastic. Many, many other microfinance investment vehicles grew up and, and raised billions of dollars to be focused on microfinance. So that model became the model for a huge industry. And today there's a huge industry of people willing to invest in microfinance institutions. And now that same capital is now increasingly going beyond microfinance into other social enterprises and other ways of innovating to help the poor. And so now we've evolved also. We continue to do microfinance institutions, but we're also now working on venture capital impact investing, all focused on innovative social enterprises that can have a big impact on the way financial services are provided to the poor. The phrase impact investing was coined by the Rockefeller Foundation a few years ago and really caught on. And obviously, a lot of investing has great impact, but what the point is, the mission, the social mission is primary. There's lots of corporations that do great things, but it's not their primary mission. But what we're talking about with impact investing is when the goal is to make a social difference, but the mechanism is a for-profit vehicle. Probably today, the microfinance industry reaches over 200 million people, and that's really just in the last 20 years or so, and largely based on that commercial approach to microfinance. As impressive as that is, I think the more impressive, the most important contribution that microfinance has made is to change the way we look at the base of the pyramid, the people living in poverty. Many of you will remember the care commercials with Sally Struthers and asking for donations, and it was a little poor African child with a tear coming to. The way we talked about poverty was really sad and focused on charity, and today, the conversation around poverty is completely different. We talk about the base of the pyramid, and we're talking about markets. We're talking about social enterprises. We're talking about places where you can invest and have a return and have a social impact. And I think that whole conversation has a lot to do with the success of microfinance. So today, we live in a time that's enormously exciting, where a lot of it used to be that when you talked about financial services for the poor, you were talking exclusively about nonprofits and then the for-profit versions, but almost all the for-profits started out as nonprofits, and they were exclusively the focus of microfinance. Today, we live in a time where it's a whole generation of startups, enterprises, banks, retailers, mobile network operators, prepaid cards, debit cards, credit cards, biometric companies, psychometric companies, all focused on the base of the pyramid because they see you can have a big social impact and also a good social return, a good financial return. We're living in a time of radical disruptive innovation in almost every aspect of financial services, whether it be new products and payments, insurance, savings, remittances, credit, how we know our customers and how the government makes its social payments, all is being completely transformed in a very, very short amount of time. There's a digital revolution, mobile phones, internet, changing what is possible. Distances that seemed too far are no longer. Transactions that were seen to be too small are no longer. The base of the pyramid that was ignored is no longer. It's a very, very exciting time. So Axion has created two vehicles to do impact investing, venture capital investing. One is called Frontier, and it does early and growth stage investing, so it'll be $1 to $5 million investments plus follow-ons in companies that have already started to generate revenues. And then we have another vehicle called Venture Lab, which is doing seed stage investing, which is more like $300,000, $400,000 invested in companies that are pre-revenues. Together, we've looked at, more than 1,000 different companies to then select about 30 investments that we've made between these two vehicles. The most interesting thing is what's happened now is because of our brand and reputation in the world of financial services for the poor, and as a nonprofit, we're willing to take risks that others aren't. It feels like if you're doing anything innovative in financial services for the poor, you call us, because we're willing to invest in things at earlier stages than others. So that pipeline is enormously valuable and very, very exciting. Let me spend just a moment talking about some of the trends we're seeing, because it really gives you a little sense. So of those 2.5 billion people that live in poverty and lack access to financial services, 80% of them today have cell phones. That's extraordinary. So the holy grail of financial inclusion is to try to figure out how can we use that cell phone to deliver financial services. So it used to be, we talked about, you are what you eat. Today, you are your phone. Your digital footprint is who you are, and it has enormous potential. This is the world of big data and algorithms. So we're seeing trends, we're seeing companies that are using that data to know your customer, to figure out what the appropriate financial products are, and just beginning to make loans. Let me describe one of the companies we're working with. You all use your cell phone, and you get your bill at the end of the month. The entire rest of the world prepays their cell phone, and then when they run out of money, calls drop. Sometimes they top up their phone in the same day. So what that means is they have the money, they just don't have it in a digital form at the right time. So at that moment in time, when they run out of money and the calls drop, this company, it's called TIAXA, makes a real-time decision to lend or not. It's incredible. And so how do they make that decision? I was with the CEO, and they said, and this is where the world of big data sort of gets to the world of Big Brother, and it's a little bit scary, but also you see the opportunity. So how much can you know about me based on how I use my prepaid cell phone only? The answer is a lot. They track 70 fields of information. So compared to your normal spending, if you prepay a lot, it's very different than if you prepay a little. If you prepay on the same day every month, it's completely different than if you prepay randomly. If you are, in this population, if you're texting, it says you're literate. If you're using a dozen cell phone towers, it's completely different than if you're only using 3 cell phone towers. If you're speaking regularly to a dozen people, it's completely different than if you're speaking regularly to 3 people. So they can paint a very sophisticated portrait, and they figure out who they should be lending to and who they're not, and they make loans over the phone, and today they get repaid 97% of the time, the same statistic as in microfinance. Now that's extraordinary. This company today is in 13 countries and makes 4 million nano loans. They don't call them micro loans, they're nano loans. They're literally like pennies to let you finish your phone call or finish what you're downloading, and they make 4 million every day. And their scale for the future, they're just beginning to take off. That's one company, but we're seeing many companies try to do this. Another one, you may have heard the phrase of machine-to-machine technology and the Internet of Things. This is the next exciting frontier. Well, one of the companies we're working with, let me take a step back. Only a fifth of sub-Saharan Africa has regular electricity. So if you want to reach people who don't have regular electricity, one of the ways to give them electricity is a solar panel. Well, a solar panel may cost $200. So for many of them, they can't afford to buy it, but they can afford $1 a day to pay for it. So they could borrow, or they could pay as you go, but to make pay as you go work, you need a device that can turn the solar lamp off if they stop paying. and it needs to be embedded in the product, and it needs to be able to work in very far away places, and it needs to be really reliable because it's a pretty rough terrain that they're working in. That's what this company does. It's called SI, and they've built these devices, and it has, I gave you the solar lamp example, but it has countless other examples where they can embed this, and then all of a sudden, you don't need the loan. So solar lamps that are prohibitive, maybe you want to borrow, but maybe you don't want to borrow $200, but now you can pay as you go, or you can prepay. It all depends on the mechanism to be able to turn it off, and that's what this device is. So it opens up enormous opportunities. Just quickly, the world of remittances. I mentioned that you can spend $15 today to send $100 over Western Union. We're working with a company that is cutting those fees by 3/4. Talk about an industry that is ripe for complete disruption. Western Union was a pioneer, but they've got bricks and mortar. You would never build Western Union if you were starting today, and that's what there's a couple of companies that are doing this. It's very, very exciting. Payments. You may know that in Kenya today, there's something called M-Pesa, where 80% of the population basically uses, think of it as airtime on your phone as a currency. So I can send you money person to person by sending you minutes on my phone. The whole country uses that. It's taken off in Kenya, unlike anywhere else in the world, in large part because Safaricom has an 80% market share monopoly. Many other countries don't have that. But what we are starting to see is other countries figure out how to do that with a more competitive environment. But it's very, very exciting. But that's just the beginning. That eliminates the need for cash, or lessens the need for cash. But the next innovation, taking the M-Pesa, the digital currency revolution to the next stage, is actually, most of the transactions today are person to person, and you need to put cash into the system and take cash out of the system. But the next thing is hooking up small mom and pop shops to this digital currency so you can actually go into a store and buy things with your airtime. Why is that important? Well, if you can solve that, you don't need to put the cash in and cash out. You can leave the cash on your system. All of a sudden, you not only have a way to make payments, but you have a reason to start saving, because you can save in a digital form because you can transact in a digital form. Plus, think about the other side of that, which is these small mom and pop shops, which are like our microfinance clients. They live in a cash world. So if they're successful or not, you would never know it because a bank could never see it. But if they can switch to a digital currency, and this is happening, we're working with a company called Kopo Kopo in Kenya today that's leveraging this M-Pesa system. If the mom and pop shop starts using a digital currency, then all of a sudden you can see their revenues and you can see their expenses, and they all of a sudden become creditworthy. If they're successful, you can lend to them, and it becomes easy, and that's exactly what Kopo Kopo is starting to do. Not only are they connecting them to M-Pesa, but they're also starting to lend to them because they see the data. So the power of digital currency can make the invisible visible. It's huge. Let me just spend a brief moment on innovation in regulation. Now, I was a regulator. I worked at the SEC. Many people think innovation and regulation is an oxymoron, sort of like jumbo shrimp. And regulators, to be fair, like to approve the same thing over and over and over again and not do anything new. And yet, in this brave new world, they sort of know they have to get to the new world and figure out how to regulate all this innovation because we are talking about financial services, and as soon as you talk about taking deposits, especially from the most vulnerable people in the world, you do worry about safety and soundness, and it needs to be appropriately regulated. But there's no global regulator. We've created, Axion has created something called the Center for Financial Inclusion, which has created the something called the SMART campaign, which is the world's first consumer protection campaign for financial services for the poor. It's in 130 countries today, and institutions have signed up to live by these principles that cover 80 million clients. And this year we're working on not just signing up to the principles, but actually have third-party rating agencies come in and certify that you're living up to these standards. And the investment community that invests in these kind of companies is looking to that to say, well, I only want to invest in a certified company. So it's becoming a standard in the industry. Another project, we're working with the Economist Intelligence Unit to do something called the microscope. And the microscope has ranked 60 countries on the regulatory environment and the depth of the market for financial services for the poor. So once a year, this report comes out, and it names and shames countries around the world. And I've literally seen the finance minister of Pakistan brag, because strangely enough, Pakistan is right up there among the best in terms of it. They have a great regulatory structure, even though they have a tiny, tiny market. They have great rules, but there's no industry yet. But they're very, very proud of their regulations, as they should be. I've also seen the Mexican regulator yell and scream at the Economist staff member who does these rankings because they fell a notch. So if you're the regulator, you care about these rankings. But what's powerful is you see every year there is innovation in financial services, and you can see it in this single document. And you can see who's advancing and who's falling back. And now we're starting to work with countries to say, you know, hey, you're 25 on this list, you want to get to the top 10, this is what you need to do. And so you can see global best practices right there. And if you want to, you know, learn how to regulate mobile money, well, right there you can see the country, and we can connect you to the person who's doing that in that country. So by doing that, there's massive transparency, and we create a dynamic that encourages best practices and regulation all around the world. Let me switch for a second. You know, all of this work is, and our approach is fundamentally to harness private market forces. We see ourselves as a catalyst, but we can catalyze the markets, but we can't, we've got to tap them, not fight against them. That's very similar to what the New York City Economic Development Corporation does here in New York City. And let me tell you a story. EDC is also a catalyst that tries to jumpstart the private markets. And let me tell you a secret. I actually get to say that I created the New York City Economic Development Corporation. Let me explain that. Obviously, many people have played a role, but I was chief of staff to the deputy mayor for finance and economic development in the Dinkins administration. And one of the first things that we did was we consolidated 7 economic development agencies into 2, one governmental, one corporate. EDC is the corporate entity. You may appreciate this, that sitting commissioners don't reorganize themselves. And the mayor and the deputy mayor actually don't put pen to paper, but I was the staff guy. I was the chief of staff, and so I actually did sort of map out what goes in what box and what goes in the other box. And no one in the world would remember that, except for one guy who happens to now be the mayor of the city of New York. So I was doing the business issues, he was doing the labor issues. Bill de Blasio was and we quickly realized that everything in this part of the administration hinged, you know, it was business versus labor. And if Bill and I could figure stuff out, we could make things happen. And if we couldn't, so we became very, very fast, you know, dear friends for many. I was actually there the day he laid eyes on Shirlene McRae, who's now his wife. And I was the guy who he was like, who is she? I need to meet her, you know. When we designed EDC, we gave it 2 superpowers. EDC, this is good stuff. You'll appreciate it. EDC is the only entity that can buy New York City real estate for $1. It's a pretty good superpower. The second superpower that EDC has is they can take real estate property off of the tax rolls and then structure a payment in lieu of taxes that can be below the tax rate. So it is the vehicle through which subsidies can be delivered to attract or retain companies or stimulate economic growth. And again, that has become a model for places around the country. So what have they done with these powers? You know, they spur the private sector. They act as a catalyst. So the redevelopment of Times Square, for example, the redevelopment of Lower Manhattan after 9/11, Roosevelt Island, Cornell Tech Center, more recently Domino Sugar, and very, very locally, downtown Brooklyn, Metrotech. This whole area was a New York City economic development project that I worked on in the 90s. It took a long time, but it's really blossomed, and it's terrific. We work with city and business leaders on policies that help new industries, like biosciences, clean energy, emerging technology. Let me say that, you know, the mayor really focused on this in the campaign. 47% of New York City residents are living at or near poverty. That is a stunning and appalling statistic in a city like this. We need to build a New York City economy that works for everyone, and EDC is very, very important in that task. The agenda of inclusive growth, raising the minimum wage, raising a livable wage, sick days, universal pre-K, affordable housing, workforce development, the zoning changes, all are part of that agenda, and all are very much supported by EDC. EDC has an economic think tank that supports a lot of those programs. In fact, just yesterday, EDC announced a new initiative specifically aimed at spurring innovation. EDC over the last few years has built a network of 29 incubators that have helped 1,000 companies by providing affordable space, training, lab equipment, and access to a network of investors. And those companies, those incubated companies, have raised over $180 million in venture capital. But they still struggle to find affordable space in this city. And so just yesterday, EDC put out a request for proposal for an urban technology growth hub, which will be space focused on these growth stage companies, particularly, all comes back together, particularly those addressing urban challenges like clean technology, energy infrastructure. And also, let me recognize my fellow board member who's here, the EDC longstanding board member, Alan Friedberg, and so thank you for coming here today, and thank you for your work at EDC. In conclusion, let me just end. It's all about catalyzing market forces and shining a light on places that have been left out for whatever reason, whether it's people, whether it's real estate, whether it's, if you can harness the market forces, you can really make a difference. In financial inclusion, we're reaching more people at the base of the pyramid than ever. A lot of this, I hope, the key challenge is we need to find more ways innovative ways of financing social innovation. I hope I've made it clear that the history of social innovation is the history of new ways of financing social innovation. They're direct, and that's not, if we can find new ways of financing these ventures, you can unlock enormous potential, and that's not conjecture, that's history, but it's also the future. We must find ways to harness the capital markets and have a great social impact. It's a very, very exciting time. We're living in a time not only of innovation in how we finance it, but just technological innovation. Everything is changing so much, so fast. I hope we can take advantage of the moment, embrace the new dynamic. There are billions of people who are waiting for food, water, education, healthcare, financial services, and much more. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. I don't know if are we doing Q&A? Yeah. Okay.
So if there are any questions for Michael, we'll take a few minutes. Anybody from the audience? Professor Askin.
Yeah, Michael, I love the idea of developing communities leapfrogging to bartering peer-to-peer digital currencies. My main concern is if things like mobile minutes and other digital assets are arguably depreciating assets, is there a mechanism in place to convert them into more stable, appreciating assets? You know, relative to food and energy, mobile minutes are going to depreciate in value over time.
As always, you're sort of asking a question that's way ahead of where we are today. Because the reality is mobile money, digital currencies are nascent. And today they are largely just payments, very, very short-term payments. I do think that there is a vision and a path forward where you can imagine payments growing into savings and this is our vision, this is what we're working on, to create a more robust array of financial services that can be delivered digitally. We are nowhere near there yet. What you're describing is if people are holding a digital currency that is depreciating, what's the consequence of that? I would love to, that would be a financially inclusive world.
This sounds like a great opportunity. Is the reason I bring it up. No one's doing it. We can come up with a conversion mechanism to convert them to more stable, appreciating assets.
I love this guy. This, let me also, where's Kevin? Let me also introduce Kevin Saunders, who is our Deputy General Counsel. And so if you ask any tough legal questions, I'm going to turn them over to Kevin. But also, as you can hear, we work at the nexus of nonprofit and for-profit, and we work in Myanmar and Lagos, and I don't think there's a single day where Kevin doesn't have a really, really interesting challenge on his desk. And he's going to be with you all day, so I hope you'll take advantage of asking him questions too. But other questions or comments?
Sure. Yeah, good morning, Michael. I'm actually excited to just learn about you today, so I'm excited about your appointment. And the key question I want to ask you, I think what you said about NYC-EDC was very clarifying for us, but recently what we've seen, at least from the previous administration, is that there's a great emphasis within the EDC to help the startup tech community in New York City. But when it came to the more distressed communities or challenged population, it's predominantly been an emphasis on real estate. Mm-hmm. And that has very little impact. So my question is, in your new capacity at EDC, what do you intend to do to achieve what's called innovation inclusion within the city, where there's more women and minorities participating in the tech sector, and also can grow in the tech sector that's formidable in New York City now compared to the West Coast?
I think you're completely right. I do think EDC historically has been fairly narrowly focused on here's a plot of land, how do we maximize what we can do with this piece of real estate, period. I do think the de Blasio approach is to think much more holistically about the community and also how to employ people in those communities. And I think that's an evolution that's not going to change overnight. But let me just tell you one story. I've not told this story publicly before, but it sort of captures a lot of this transition from the old EDC to the new EDC. So Bill and I were kids in the Dinkins administration, and we were briefing the mayor at Gracie Mansion, and we jumped in a cab to get back to City Hall, and Bill paid for the cab, and he gave a generous tip. So much so that I must have made some sort of reaction and said, whoa, because we were young kids making on government salaries, and he looked at me, and he just stopped and he said, do you have any idea how much they take home and how much they get in take home pay? And you have to appreciate that. So I'm the economic development guy, right? I'm all about jobs and promoting the economy, but he is focused on take home pay. He's focused on the reality of living in the city. I'm like abstract. Jobs are good. That's good. But he's, and it was so powerful. And I actually think over all this time, I do think it's that focus that has shaped his agenda of minimum wage, universal pre-K, sick days, affordable housing. It's really about people. It's really about people. It's not about that just real estate development or just that abstract notion of jobs. So now what does that really mean? I do think we're still figuring that out. And actually, he's not here today, but there's a Brooklyn Law professor, Sabeel Rahman, who's just spent the last year working on economic development strategy with the de Blasio administration. I think we're, first and foremost, it's a much more holistic approach to the whole community. And also, What you see in the papers is often real estate transactions. But so, for example, there is something called the Center for Economic Transformation within EDC that is a think tank that is coming up with things that look so much beyond just real estate transactions. So I think that's an evolution that's happening. I know that's happening. I think we're still figuring it out. It's very, very important evolution in the de Blasio administration.
And I would be delighted if we had the entire day to talk with Michael. I'll take one final question.
Nobody from Student Center. Anyway, good morning and thank you for really giving us a lot of information that I am very impressed. But most of all, I want to thank my alma mater, Brooklyn Law School. It was mentioned a number of times. Change is nothing new.
I love that.
So thank you for that. My question, I'm Marilu Galvan, and I graduated from here. I don't practice, but I am very active in nonprofit organization, Centro Cívico Cultural Dominicano. It is the oldest Dominican organization. It's 52 years old. And my greatest concern is that everything that is presented and that we have access to information, it looks so beautiful. But when it comes to the nitty-gritty needs of the community, as the gentleman back there stated, we are left out because the bigger nonprofit get all the attention, they get all the money, they are able to pay for good staff, they spend a lot of good money on paying them, but the little ones never, ever get anything. And if we get like a little grant through the Department of Cultural Affairs, $5,000, you have to pay a grant writer, you have to pay at the end to do a financial report, what is there? So my biggest concern is this. We are interested in building something in perpetuity for this organization. We have the area where my husband and myself supported. He's an emeritus professor from Columbia University. We spend our Social Security and our pension on this organization. We want to build up a permanent museum, plus the gallery, plus theater and community. We have an ongoing program that is so ambitious that people keep telling me, how is it that you can do it? I said, you know what? You have to have passion in order to be able to involve. So my point is this, and I'm doing it openly in front of everybody. I would like to take advantage of your presentation and the fact that you are involved and that you created this organization, not Action, but the Economic Development Corporation, which will affect me more directly than the other Action, which is doing a fabulous job, and congratulations.
So
I want to see how can we take advantage of getting the process through to start to build up a permanent place for Centro Cívico Cultural Dominicano and to have some kind of investment that will assure my mental state that it will have an income in the long term. And I'm not asking you for the income, okay?
So, first of all, thank you for your question, and also thank you for your generosity and your philanthropy. The broader issue of the big culturals and the big parks, and you know, frankly, if I can quote the mayor who was quoting, it's a tale of two cities, absolutely, and there's no question, and I do think he very specifically is trying to figure out how to help the smaller cultural institutions and the smaller parks and make that a little bit more fair. So I hope you took away from my remarks the importance of building social enterprises that are sustainable and viable. I can promise you that if you can go to the city and say, here's our business plan and here's the revenue that we're going to generate, you will get a much better response than if it is just a perpetual black hole where it'll never cover itself. The city and philanthropists, you know, the philanthropic community, look to catalyze something, but not support things in perpetuity. So I don't know what you're trying to do, but if you can show a business plan that is real, that can show viability, you'll have a much better chance getting support. So I don't know the details, obviously, but let's we can talk afterwards. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I would expect that we all have our takeaways, and thank you, Michael, for those remarks. I just mentioned a few that occur to me. In addition to directing CUBE, I teach a course here called The Law of Entrepreneurship, and one of the things that we talk about in that course is that there are structures which you learn the structures, and they can be applied across many different subjects and scales of issues. And I think one of the things that I take away here is that the structures that Axion and others are creating at the base of the pyramid are very likely ahead of the curve and are going to be the structures that all of us who are often more fortunate are going to be living with and learning from. The second is that if I ever have the opportunity to introduce Michael again, I'm certainly going to mention his matchmaking skills, since he seems to have done very well for our mayor. And the third is that we should probably have a slide up here that says, call Axion, because I suspect that Michael's cell phone will be ringing in response to that suggestion. So we're going to take a quick break while our next panel assembles here. And again, thank you, Michael Schlein.